The morning Mae Blackwell finally broke was not a dramatic one, not the kind of morning that announces itself with thunder or a sky gone strange with color, but rather an ordinary Tuesday in the autumn of 1882, when the dust settled thick on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, and the smell of horsehide and coffee drifted through the open door of Hattie Crane's dry goods store, and Mae stood in the middle of that store holding a spool of brown thread she did not need. Shaking from somewhere so deep inside herself that she could not name the place. She was 32 years old. She had been a widow for 6 years. She had not told a single living soul how it felt. Not her sister in Missouri, who sent letters asking if she was managing. Not Reverend Holly's, who sometimes stopped her after Sunday service and placed a broad hand on her shoulder and looked at her with the kind of practiced sympathy that was really just a performance of sympathy. Not even her daughter Clara, who was 8 years old and still sometimes asked why Papa did not come back from the drive, and to whom Mae always said the same thing in the same calm voice, that Papa was with the angels, that he loved them both, that he was watching. Mae always said those things. Mae always sounded steady. Mae was known in Caldwell as a steady woman, a composed woman, a woman who kept her homestead running and her daughter fed and her fence posts mended, who baked bread for the church socials and did not weep at the grave markers in the cemetery on the edge of town even when she passed them on her way to market. Mae was steady. Mae was fine. Mae was not fine. She set the spool of thread down on the counter and walked out of the store and stood on the boardwalk in the October sun, and she pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and breathed, slow and deliberate, the way she had been breathing for 6 years, the way she had trained herself to breathe when the grief came up in her like floodwater, pushing against every seam. She heard a horse at the hitching post beside her, a big roan gelding with a patient, long-lashed face, and she heard the creak of a saddle being loosened, and she heard a man's voice, quiet and unhurried, talking to the horse the way some men talk to horses, like the horse understood and deserved the courtesy. She did not look at the man right away. She was too busy breathing. She heard his boots on the boardwalk slow and even, and then the boots stopped. "You all right, ma'am?" The voice was not loud. It was not the forced cheerfulness of someone who wanted to be thanked for asking. It was just a question, plain as a nail, offered without expectation. Mae lowered her hands from her eyes and looked at the man who had spoken. He was tall, lean in the way that men who work outdoors are lean, with weathered skin and dark hair shot through with a thread of gray at the temples, and he wore a dust-colored coat and a battered brown hat, and he was looking at her with eyes that were a very dark shade of brown, almost black, and those eyes were simply waiting. He was not handsome in any obvious way. He was the kind of man you looked at twice because the first look did not quite finish the job. "I am fine," Mae said, because that was what Mae always said. The man nodded slowly, as though he had heard what was underneath the words as well as the words themselves. "All right," he said. He did not move on. He did not make a business of staying either. He simply stood at a slight angle to her, looking out at the street, and there was something in his stillness that was unlike the fidgety, performative stillness of people waiting for you to be done with your crisis so they could be helpful and leave. He was just there, like a fence post, like something planted. Mae looked at his profile for a moment. He had a long jaw and a straight nose and a small scar above his left eyebrow, old and silver, the kind of scar that had been made a long time ago and had settled in as part of the landscape of the face. "I am not fine," Mae heard herself say. She did not plan it. She did not decide it. It came out of her mouth before she had assembled any defense against it, and for one terrible second she thought she would simply dissolve right there on the boardwalk in front of Hattie Crane's dry goods store. The man turned his head and looked at her again, not with alarm, not with that horrible sympathetic widening of the eyes that people did when they were trying to decide what to do with your suffering. He just looked at her, steady and unhurried, and nodded once. "You want to sit," he said. He gestured to the bench outside the store. Mae sat. She could not have explained why she did it, She had not intended to sit. She had intended to collect herself and go back inside and buy the thread she did not need and walk home. But she sat, and the man sat on the far end of the bench, leaving a respectful space between them, and he rested his forearms on his knees and looked at the street, and he waited. Mae looked at her hands in her lap. Her hands were calloused and strong, a farm woman's hands, and she looked at the thin white line on her left ring finger where her wedding band had been. The band she had removed 18 months after Thomas died because the ranch foreman had made an assumption she found intolerable, and she had needed to remove every possible signal that she was unclaimed. She had put the ring in a tin box under her bed. She thought about it sometimes. "My husband died," Mae said. "I am sorry," the man said. His voice did not perform sorrow, it simply meant it. "It was 6 years ago," Mae said. "A cattle drive. He was thrown from his horse in the night in a river crossing in Texas. They did not find him until morning. He was 31 years old." The man said nothing. He was listening. She could feel him listening the way you can sometimes feel the weather changing, a shift in the pressure of the air around you. "Everyone told me I was so strong," Mae said, and she heard the edge of something raw in her own voice, something she had not heard there in a very long time. "Everyone said how well I was doing, how proud Thomas would be, how composed I was, how I was managing so beautifully." She paused. "And I believed them for a while. I thought that managing was the same thing as healing. I thought that if I kept the farm and fed my daughter and did not fall to pieces in public, that meant I was healed. That the grief was done with. But it is not done," the man said. It was not a question. "It is not done," Mae agreed. "It is never done. It sits inside me like a stone in a river. The water goes around it, the water finds a way, but the stone never moves." She stopped again. She had not said any of this aloud before, not to anyone. She had thought it in the dark of her bedroom, lying on the side of the bed that was still her side of the bed because she had never once in 6 years slept in the middle. She had thought it, but she had not said it, and saying it was different. Saying it made it real in a way that thinking it did not, and she understood now why she had kept it locked inside, because real things can hurt you in real ways. "His name was Thomas," she said. "Thomas Blackwell. He was a cattle rancher, a good one. He had big hands and he laughed too loud and he could not carry a tune, but he sang to Clara every night before she slept. He was afraid of snakes. He read the Bible most nights, but he was not devout. He just liked the stories. He could fix anything that was broken, anything at all. He could look at a broken thing for 5 minutes and then he would know how to put it right." She stopped. Her voice had dropped to something almost private, something not intended for volume. "He cannot fix this," she said. "And I have been angry at him for dying. For 6 years I have been angry at him, and I have not said it to anyone because what kind of woman is angry at her dead husband? What kind of woman blames a man for his horse slipping in a dark river crossing in Texas?" "A humankind," the man said quietly. Mae looked at him. His eyes were still on the street, not in the way of a man who was not paying attention, but in the way of a man who understood that sometimes it is easier to speak to someone who is not looking directly at you, and he had intuited this, or simply known it, and he had arranged himself accordingly. She felt something shift in her chest. Not a breaking, more like a loosening, the way a knot that has been pulled too tight for too long will sometimes ease when you stop pulling against it. "I have a daughter," Mae said. "Clara. She is 8. She has his eyes, dark green like creek water. She does not remember him much now. She asks me sometimes what he was like and I tell her. I have a whole store of stories I keep for her. I take them out carefully and hand them to her one at a time. The time he rode the plow horse in a race and came in last and declared it a victory of character. The time he brought home 3 barn cats he named after presidents. The time he stayed up all night nursing a sick calf and fell asleep in the barn, and me found him in the morning with the calf asleep on his boots." She was almost smiling. It was a painful almost smile, the kind that is very close to weeping. "She laughs at those stories," Mae said. "She loves them, and I love that she loves them, But when she goes to bed and the lamp is out and the house is quiet, there is no one to tell the stories to. There is no one who was there when those things happened. There is no one else in the world who holds those memories the same way I do. And that is the part that no one understands. It is not just losing the person. It is losing the shared version of everything. It is losing the witness. She stopped. She had run out of words for a moment, not because there were no more words, but because she had spent so many of them so quickly that she needed to breathe. The man was silent. He had not moved. He had not offered a single platitude or a piece of unsolicited wisdom or a comparison to his own loss. He had just sat there and received everything she said, like a vessel large enough to hold it without spilling. She became aware, suddenly, that she did not know his name. "I am sorry," she said, and her voice had changed. It was softer now, slightly embarrassed. "I do not know what came over me. I have said more to you in 5 minutes than I have said to anyone in 6 years, and I do not even know your name." The man turned his head and looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was not pity and was not discomfort and was not the slightly panicked eagerness of someone who wants to be released from an emotional conversation. It was something quieter, something that looked, if me were naming it carefully, like gratitude. "Arthur Quinn," he said, "I am a cattle drover, passing through on my way up from Texas." Me absorbed this. Texas. The word sat between them for a moment, heavy and particular. "Mae Blackwell," she said. "I know," Arthur said. "Hattie Crane pointed you out to me when I came in for supplies this morning. She said you were the most capable woman in Caldwell." Me let out a sound that was half a laugh and half something more complicated. "Hattie means well," me said. "She does," Arthur agreed. "But capable is a hard word. It leaves a person alone a lot." Me looked at him. He was looking at the street again. She studied his profile, that long jaw, that small silver scar, the way his hands hung loosely between his knees, and she thought that this was perhaps the strangest morning of the last 6 years, stranger even than the morning she had buried her husband, because that morning had at least made a kind of terrible sense. This morning made no sense at all, and yet it felt, in some way she could not articulate, necessary. "You should come to supper," she said, and then immediately wondered where the words had come from. Arthur turned and looked at her. He was not startled exactly, but he was attentive. "I would not want to impose," he said. "You listen to me," me said. "That is not nothing, and I have a pot of beef stew on the stove that will serve 3. Clara likes company." He considered her for a moment. She could see him weighing it, not in a suspicious way but in a careful one, the way a man considers whether he is the right tool for a particular job. "All right," he said. "Thank you, me." Her name in his mouth was something she felt rather than just heard. She filed this information away in the practical part of her brain and did not examine it. She stood. He stood. They stood on the boardwalk in the October sun and looked at each other for one full second, and it was not awkward and it was not charged. It was something simpler and more fundamental, two people recognizing something in each other that they could not quite name. "Supper is at 6, me said. "The Blackwell place is 2 miles east on the Kisham Road. There is a windmill you can see from a 1/4 mile off." "I will find it," Arthur said. Me walked back into Hattie Crane's store and bought the spool of brown thread she did not need, and Hattie looked at her with narrowed eyes and said, "You look different." "Do I?" me said. "You look like you had a good cry," Hattie said. "You needed one. Lord knows you have been wound up tighter than a watch spring for 6 years." Me paid for her thread and said goodbye to Hattie and did not cry until she was in the wagon, alone on the Kisham Road with the October sky spread wide above her and the horses moving easy. And then she cried properly and fully, the way she had not let herself cry in 6 years. Not ugly or theatrical, but simply present, simply real. And by the time she reached the windmill she could see from a 1/4 mile off, she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like someone who had set down a very heavy thing. She had set it down in the lap of a stranger with dark eyes and a patient manner, and a horse he talked to. And she did not understand it, but she was beginning to believe that the heart does not always ask your permission before it starts to heal. The Blackwell homestead sat on a gentle rise above a creek that ran clear most of the year, and in the October light, it had a particular kind of beauty that Mae rarely let herself notice. A beauty that belonged to the practical world of split-rail fences and weathered barns and kitchen gardens going brown at the edges for the season. The house was solid and well kept, the kind of house that said a capable person lived here, and Mae had always hated that word and was only now beginning to understand why. Capable meant you managed. Capable meant you did not need anything. Capable was a door that other people could close on their way out. Clara was in the yard when Mae drove the wagon in, chasing the barn cats with a long piece of straw and laughing at them in the uncomplicated way that 8-year-olds laugh, with her whole body, and she had Thomas's green eyes and Mae's dark hair and the kind of energy that made even a tired October afternoon feel kinetic. "Mama," Clara called. "Biscuit caught a mouse. A real one." And then she dropped it and it ran away, and she is very cross about it. "I imagine she is," Mae said, climbing down from the wagon. Clara came running and took the thread and the other small parcels from her mother's hands with the helpful proprietary air of a child who considers herself essential to the household operations, which she was, and they went inside together into the warmth of the kitchen, where the beef stew was doing exactly what it was supposed to do on the iron stove. "We are having a guest for supper," Mae said. Clara looked up with the instantaneous interest of a child who has been lonely without quite knowing it. "Who?" she asked. "A cattle drover named Arthur Quinn," Mae said. "He is passing through from Texas." Clara considered this with great seriousness. "Does he have a horse?" she asked. "He does. A big roan gelding." "Good," Clara said, satisfied, and went to set an extra place at the table with the brisk efficiency of someone who has made an executive decision. Mae stood in her kitchen and looked at the ordinary walls of it, the calendar from 1882, the shelf of preserves she had put up in August, Thomas's rifle still hanging above the door because she had never found a reason to move it, and she thought about what she had said on that boardwalk, the whole unbridled torrent of it, and she waited for the shame to come. It did not come. What came instead was something that felt, tentatively, like relief. Arthur Quinn arrived at 6 o'clock precisely, which Mae noted because men who arrived at precisely the time they said they would arrive were either military or had a fundamental respect for other people's time, and she suspected Arthur Quinn was the latter rather than the former. He had cleaned up. His coat was brushed and his hat was in his hands when she opened the door, and his dark hair was still damp at the temples from washing, and he looked at her with the same undemanding steadiness he had shown on the boardwalk, and Mae stepped back and said, "Come in." He stepped into the kitchen and looked around it in the way that people look around a room they want to understand, not nosily but attentively, and Clara appeared from around the corner of the stove and regarded him with the frank assessment of a child who has not yet learned to pretend she is not looking. "Hello," Clara said. "Hello," Arthur said. "You must be Clara." "I am," Clara said. "What is your horse's name?" Arthur smiled for the first time, and it changed his face in a way that Mae found she wanted to look at for a while. "His name is Dallas," Arthur said. "He is tied at the post. He is probably eating your grass." "That is all right," Clara said generously. "We have extra grass." Mae served the stew and the cornbread she had made with the practiced efficiency of a woman who cooked for herself and her daughter without ceremony. But she had put out the good tin plates tonight, the ones with the blue rim, and she was aware of this choice in a way that she did not quite wish to examine. They ate. Arthur ate like a man who had been eating trail food for weeks and was grateful for something that had flavor, and he complimented the stew with a simple directness that was not flattery, just honesty, and Clara talked about the barn cats and the mouse, and the general injustice of mice who escaped when they had already been caught. And Arthur listened to all of it with the same quality of attention he had given Mae on the boardwalk, which Mae realized was simply how he listened to everything and everyone. not more or less, attentively based on whether the speaker was an 8-year-old or an adult. She thought about what that quality of attention must feel like to grow up with, and she thought it must feel like being held, in the best possible way. After supper, Clara was persuaded to go and see to Dallas with the specific bribe of being allowed to give him an apple from the barrel in the barn, and me and Arthur sat at the table with the remains of the meal between them, and the lamp throwing its warm circle of light around them, and the October wind beginning to say something outside the walls. "She is extraordinary," Arthur said, meaning Clara. "She is," me said. "She is the best thing I have ever done." Arthur looked at the table for a moment, then he looked at me. "Thank you for saying what you said today," he told her. "On the boardwalk." Me looked at him. "You are thanking me for breaking down on a public boardwalk and telling my entire history to a stranger. I am thanking you for trusting me with it," he said. "That is not a small thing. Most people spend their whole lives not saying the things that matter the most." Me was quiet for a moment. The wind outside had picked up and was pressing against the windows with a cold, insistent hand. "Do you have things that matter the most that you have not said?" she asked. It was a bold question, and she knew it as she asked it, but she found she had spent her boldness already today, and there was a kind of freedom in having nothing left to protect. Arthur was quiet for a long moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I was married," he said. "A long time ago, before the war. Her name was Rosalie. She died of fever in 1864. I was in Tennessee when it happened. I got the letter 3 weeks after she was already in the ground." Me said nothing. She understood the particular shape of that kind of loss, the absence that has already become fact by the time you learn of it. The way grief in that case is doubled because you have to go back and fill in the days you did not know were days of absence. "I have been driving cattle for 18 years, Arthur said. "It is a good life if you do not mind the fact that it is not a life so much as a long series of roads that go through other people's lives." Me heard the loneliness in this and did not try to minimize it. "How old are you?" she asked. 38, he said. She nodded, 6 years older than her. She had not thought about such things in 6 years, and she was startled to realize she was thinking about them now. "Where do you go from here?" she asked. "After Caldwell." "North," he said. "To Wichita. I have a delivery to make, a small herd. After that I have not decided." He was looking at her when he said this last part, and she held his gaze and understood that the undecided part was something he was saying with a specific intention, and she found that instead of the panicked flight response she had expected to feel, she felt something else entirely. She felt interested. Over the following days, Arthur Quinn did not leave Caldwell. He did not announce that he was staying. He did not make any declarations. He delivered his small herd to the stockyard in Wichita, a 2-day ride north, and he came back to Caldwell with the quiet matter-of-factness of someone who has had a thought that cannot be unthought, and he took a room at the Drover's Inn on the south end of town. Me heard from Hattie Crane that he had taken the room. Hattie told her this with the studied casualness of a woman who was very carefully not making it into a thing, which meant that Hattie was absolutely making it into a thing. "He seems like a decent sort," Hattie said, measuring out flour with a practiced hand. "Quiet, pays what he owes. Pete Duggan says he is handy with a horse." "That is useful," me said. "Indeed it is," Hattie said, and looked at me over the rim of her spectacles with an expression that communicated, without a single word, that she knew exactly what was happening and approved of it entirely. Arthur came to call on the Friday of that week. He came properly, in the afternoon, with his hat in his hands and a jar of honey he had traded for at the mercantile, because he had remembered that Clara had mentioned the barn cats liked to knock things off the kitchen shelf, and one of the things they had knocked off was the honey jar, and it had broken. Clara received the honey with the solemn gratitude of someone being given something both practical and thoughtful, and me made coffee, and they sat on the front porch in the thin autumn sun and talked. They talked easily. That was the thing me kept noting, the ease of it, the way conversation with Arthur Quinn did not feel like hauling water uphill. He was curious without being intrusive, and he had opinions without insisting on them. And he listened, always he listened, in that particular way that was starting to feel to me like the most important quality a person could possess. He told her about the cattle trails, the Kishim and the Western, and the long flat stretches of Texas grassland that went on so far that the horizon looked like something invented by the imagination rather than the land. He told her about the men he had worked with, drovers and wranglers and cooks who ruled their chuck wagons like minor emperors, and he told her about the cattle themselves, the particular personalities of individual animals that people who did not work with cattle did not expect cattle to have. Mae told him about the homestead, about the crop rotation she had worked out in her second year of running the farm alone, about the agreement she had with the neighboring rancher, a widower named Grover Hatch who was 55 and reliable, to share fencing labor in exchange for use of her creek in dry months. She told him about Clara's lessons with the schoolteacher Mrs. Aldrich, who was strict but good, and about the church choir in which Mae sang alto, not because she was particularly religious, but because the singing itself felt necessary, because making a large sound with other people was one of the ways she had found to feel less alone. "That makes sense to me," Arthur said when she told him this. "There is something about voices together. Trail drives used to have a man who sang to the cattle at night, not for the cattle, though they did settle better for it, for the men. Singing in the dark with other people around you is a particular kind of not being alone." Mae looked at him. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly it." Clara was inside, doing her Friday lessons, and the October afternoon was turning cold at the edges, and Mae was aware that she did not want Arthur Quinn to leave. This awareness arrived quietly, not dramatically, not with the thunderclap quality of the dime novels that Hattie Crane kept behind the counter of her store. It arrived the way a certainty arrives, just by being there when you notice it. Arthur came back the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. He helped me split firewood on a morning when Grover Hatch had sent word that he was down with a bad knee and could not come, and he split it with the methodical efficiency of a man who found physical work satisfying rather than punishing. And Clara brought him water from the well and watched him with the proprietary pride of a child who has decided to adopt someone. Mae stood in the barn door and watched him work and felt something she had not felt in 6 years, something that was not grief and was not the absence of grief, but was its own thing entirely, warm and complicated and a little frightening. On a Wednesday evening in the second week of November, Arthur was helping me repair a section of the porch railing that had been loose since summer, and they were working side by side in the lamplight that spilled out through the window, and Clara had fallen asleep inside, and it was cold enough that their breath made small clouds, and Mae handed Arthur a nail and their fingers touched and they both went still. Not frozen still. Not the theatrical stillness of someone waiting for a cue, just still. The way a moment can be still when it is full of something that has not yet been named. Arthur looked at her. His dark eyes were very serious, and that small silver scar above his eyebrow caught the lamplight. "Mae," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "I am not a man who says things he does not mean, and I will not start now. I have been in Caldwell for 3 weeks, and the only reason I have stayed is because of you and Clara. And I understand that you have a life here, a whole life, and that you are not looking for someone to ride in and claim a place in it. I understand that." "You understand that," Mae said. "I do," he said, "but I want you to know what I feel, in case knowing it matters to you." Mae was quiet. The wind moved through the yard and the lamp behind the window threw its light over them both. "It matters to me," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "I have been alone for 18 years, he said. "Not because I wanted to be, because the roads kept going and I kept following them and there was never a place that asked me to stop. And then I came to Caldwell, and a woman on a boardwalk told me the truest things she knew, and I knew that I did not want to go on to the next road." Me felt something tighten in her throat. She looked at the nail she was still holding. Thomas was the love of my life, she said carefully. I will not lie to you about that. I know, Arthur said. I would not ask you to. And I am afraid, she said. I am afraid of the thing you are suggesting, not because of you, because of what it means to choose to risk that kind of loss again. I am afraid too, he said. She looked up at him. He met her eyes with a steadiness that was not pretending to be something other than what it was. Then we are both afraid, she said. Then we are both afraid, he agreed. She handed him the nail and he took it, and their fingers touched again, and this time neither of them went still. He turned the nail in his hand and drove it into the porch railing, and the railing was solid again. It was, me thought, a remarkably good metaphor. In the weeks that followed, Arthur Quinn became a presence in the Blackwell homestead the way that good things sometimes become presences, gradually and then all at once. And then you cannot quite imagine the shape of the days without that presence. And the absence of it, even temporarily, registers as something the body notices before the mind catches up. He took on work at the Caldwell stockyards, which needed experienced drovers to handle the late-season cattle coming up from Texas and Oklahoma territory. And he was good at it, very good, the kind of good that gets remarked on by men who do not usually remark on things. The foreman at the stockyard, a lean Texan named Holt Meadows, offered Arthur a permanent position in December, and Arthur told me about it that evening over supper, and me kept her expression carefully neutral until Clara went to do her lessons. "Are you considering it?" she asked. "I am," he said. "If there is a reason to stay in Caldwell past the season, I am considering it." She looked at him across the table. The lamp was between them and the night was outside the windows and the fire was doing its good work in the stove. "There is a reason to stay in Caldwell," she said, "if you want one." He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I want one." She nodded. Her heart was doing something complicated that she decided not to narrate to herself. "Then stay," she said. He accepted the position at the stockyard the following morning. He did not move into the homestead. He was careful about that, careful in a way that me respected enormously, careful about Clara, and about the way the town might look at things and about the pace at which trust is built. He stayed at the Drovers Inn through December and came to supper 4 nights a week, and spent Sundays helping with the endless maintenance work of a working farm. And Clara taught him the names of all the barn cats and showed him her schoolwork with the proprietorial pride of a child who has decided he is already family and is now simply providing him the orientation. One evening in December, me found Arthur sitting on the front steps in the dark after supper, and Clara was inside, and the night was very cold and very clear, the stars hard and bright overhead the way they got in the Kansas winter. She brought him a coffee and sat beside him and they looked at the stars for a while. "There are nights on the trail," Arthur said, "when the sky does this and you are a very small thing in a very large world, and that used to feel lonely to me, just pure lonely." "And now?" me asked. "Now I am sitting next to someone," he said, and looked at her, and the simplicity of it, the absolute uncomplicated truth of it, was more romantic than anything me had ever heard said in her life. She leaned against his shoulder. He was warm and solid and he did not move. He just stayed, and she thought about the fact that staying was the most radical thing a person could offer her at this particular point in her life, and that Arthur Quinn understood this without being told. December deepened and Christmas came. Me had always made Christmas something good for Clara, because Clara deserved goodness, and because Thomas had loved Christmas with a childlike enthusiasm that had been one of his most endearing qualities. And me had continued the traditions they had made together, the paper chains and the molasses cookies and the candle in the window, not only because they were good for Clara, but because they were a way of holding Thomas in the house without being destroyed by him. This year, Arthur was at the house on Christmas morning. He came with presents, modest and thoughtful ones, a set of colored pencils for Clara that she had mentioned once in passing weeks ago, and he had remembered, and a small framed piece of needlework for me, a blue heron on brown cloth, because Mae had mentioned once that she had seen a blue heron on the creek the first morning after Thomas died, and had stood watching it for a very long time, and it had meant something. She still was not sure what. Mae held the framed heron in her hands and looked at Arthur Quinn and thought that she was in love with him, and that this was real, and that she was not afraid of it anymore. She did not say this on Christmas morning, but she thought it, and the thinking of it was something that sat inside her like warmth, like a good fire in a cold room. Clara opened her pencils and held them up one by one and announced each color with the reverence of someone inventorying something precious. And Arthur watched her with an expression that was so open and so full that Mae had to look away from it for a moment because it was too much to take in all at once. After Christmas dinner, Clara fell asleep in front of the fire with a barn cat on her feet, and Mae and Arthur sat together on the settee, and Mae said quietly, so as not to wake Clara, "I am glad you stayed." "So am I," Arthur said. She looked at him. He was close enough that she could see the texture of the worn wool of his coat and the fine lines at the corners of his eyes when he looked at her. "Arthur," she said. "Mae," he said. "I would like you to court me properly," she said. "I would like, if you are willing, to do this the right way." He looked at her, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. Not unguarded in the way of someone who has forgotten to protect himself, but unguarded in the way of someone who has decided he does not need to. "I am more than willing," he said. He took her hand, there in the lamplight with the fire and the sleeping child and the barn cats and the winter outside the windows, and he held it with a gentleness that was not fragile but simply precise, the right amount, the right thing. That was the first night Mae slept through without waking in the early dark hours to stare at the ceiling and feel the stone of grief lying in the river of her chest. She noted this in the morning with a kind of quiet wonder. January in Caldwell, Kansas in 1883 was not kind to anyone. The winds came down from the north with a seriousness of purpose that was almost personal, and the cattle in the stockyard moved in tight, steaming clusters, and the streets were half-frozen mud that made every trip to town an exercise in determination. Arthur came to the homestead every day in January, not just 4 nights a week, because the roads were dangerous in the worst weather and Mae had a farm to keep running, and a daughter to keep warm and a windmill that developed a worrying creak in mid-January that Arthur diagnosed correctly as a worn gear, and fixed in an afternoon despite the cold, coming in afterward with red hands and a pleased expression that Clara treated as a personal victory. Mae watched him with her daughter and felt something she had been afraid to feel for so long that it had begun to feel like an obsolete capacity, like a sense that had gone dormant. She felt joy. Not the useful, functional, managed feeling she had told herself was joy for 6 years, but the real thing, the inconvenient and overwhelming and grateful real thing. One afternoon in the 3rd week of January, a man came to the Blackwell homestead that Mae had not seen in 2 years. His name was Cody Mays, and he had worked with Thomas on the ranch before Thomas's death, and had since set himself up as a small-time speculator in land and cattle, and he had never quite looked at Mae in a way she found acceptable, and she had kept her distance from him accordingly. He came to the door in the afternoon when Arthur was at the stockyard and Clara was at school, and he stood on the repaired porch with his hat in his hands and his small pale eyes moving over the house with the assessing quality of a man taking inventory. "Widow Blackwell," he said, "I have come with a proposition." Mae stood in the doorway and did not invite him in. "I am listening," she said. "I understand your situation," Cody Mays said. "Running this place alone, it is impressive, truly. But this is hard country for a woman by herself, and I think you know that. I am prepared to offer you a fair price for the acreage east of the creek, and I think we ought to discuss other arrangements as well if you take my meaning, because a woman like you needs—" "I do not need," Mae said clearly, "anything that you are suggesting. The east acreage is not for sale, and I am not a widow in search of arrangements, Mr. Mays. I am a woman with a farm and a daughter and no particular interest in your propositions." Mae's expression shifted. The hat in his hand stopped moving. "You have been spending time with that drover," he said. "Quinn, people talk, me. People talk about everything in a town this size," Mae said. "It has never been any of my business what people say. A man with no land and no stake and a history of going from trail to trail," Mae said. "That is not security, that is not a future. The East acreage is not for sale," Mae said. "Good afternoon, Mr. Mays." She closed the door. She stood behind it for a moment and breathed, and then she went back to the stove and stirred the pot and did not give Cody Mays another thought, except to note that she had handled it cleanly and without Arthur's help, and this mattered to her more than she could quite explain. When Arthur came to supper that evening, she told him about it, not because she needed him to do anything but because she had decided that she did not want to keep things from him out of the old habit of managing alone. Arthur listened. He did not immediately offer to go find Mays and have words with him. He did not suggest she should have handled it differently. He said, "Are you all right?" "I am perfectly all right," Mae said. "I have been handling Cody Mays and men like him since Thomas died. I just wanted you to know." He nodded slowly, and his expression was the particular kind of warm that it got when she said something that pleased him. "You are something else, Mae Blackwell," he said. "I know that," she said, and he laughed genuinely, a full sound that Clara came running from the next room to investigate because she had decided some time ago that when Arthur laughed, it was worth being present for. February brought a thaw and then a freeze and then another thaw, the indecisive weather of a Kansas winter approaching its end, and Arthur had settled into Caldwell with the thoroughness of a man who has stopped looking at the door. He had moved out of the drover's inn and into a small house at the edge of town, 2 rooms and a good stove and a stable for Dallas. And the house was not much, but it was a place, and a place was something. He asked me to walk with him in the second week of February, on a Sunday afternoon when the thaw was holding, and the air had a tentative quality, not yet spring but no longer winter's deepest intention. They walked along the creek that ran below the homestead, bare-armed cottonwoods and dead grass in the clear cold water moving over its stones, and Clara ran ahead of them chasing a red-tailed hawk with her eyes, and me and Arthur walked side by side with their breath making small clouds. "I want to ask you something," Arthur said. "Then ask it," Mae said. He stopped walking. She stopped with him. Clara was 20 feet ahead, hands shading her eyes, hawk watching. Arthur turned to face her. He was holding his hat, which he had taken off, and he looked at her with that direct gaze that had undone her on the boardwalk 4 months ago, and had been undoing her in smaller ways ever since. "I would like to marry you," he said. "If you will have me, I'm not Thomas and I will never be Thomas, and I'm not asking to replace anything or anyone. I'm asking to be here, with you and Clara, for as long as you will let me be here." Mae looked at him. Her chest was doing the thing it had been doing for 4 months, that complicated, warm thing. "That is a very good answer to a question I did not ask," she said. "I am asking in advance," he said, "in case the question arises." She smiled. It was a real smile, not the careful, managed, almost smile she had been producing for 6 years, but the genuine full thing. "Arthur Quinn," she said. "Yes." He blinked. She had answered before he had finished asking in any formal sense, and his expression went through several things in quick succession before it arrived at something that looked like a man who has received something he wanted very much and is trying to take in the reality of it. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you. I want to marry you. I have been wanting to marry you since approximately December, and I have been waiting for you to ask." He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he put his hat back on his head and took her face in both his hands, careful as someone holding something they intended to keep, and he kissed her, there by the cold creek with the cottonwoods overhead and Clara still hawk-watching 20 feet away. It was a gentle kiss, unhurried, and it tasted like cold air and honesty and everything Mae had not let herself want for 6 years. And when it ended, she kept her eyes closed for a moment because she wanted to keep the feeling complete a moment longer. When she opened them, Clara was standing 6 feet away watching them with an expression of supreme satisfaction. "I knew it," Clara said. "Did you?" Mee said. "Yes," Clara said. "I have known since Christmas. Biscuit knew before me, but I figured it out shortly after." "We will take the cat's opinion under advisement," Arthur said, and Clara laughed and Mee laughed, and the red-tailed hawk went on circling somewhere above the bare cottonwoods, riding the cold air with the total confidence of something that knows exactly where it is. They told people carefully, starting with Hattie Crane, because Hattie would need a moment to be right about it, and Mee had always believed in letting people have their rightness gracefully. Hattie said, "Well, it is about time," and then she said more softly that she was glad, and she hugged me the way old friends hug when they are saying something they cannot quite say directly. Reverend Hollies expressed his pleasure in the way Reverend Hollies expressed everything, with long sentences and biblical parallels, but underneath the performance Mee could see that he was genuinely happy for her, and she accepted his happiness without deflecting it. Grover Hatch, the neighboring widower, shook Arthur's hand and said that anyone who was taking on the Blackwell homestead and its creek and its east acreage and the most formidable woman in Caldwell County needed to be either very brave or very smart, and that he hoped for Arthur's sake he was both. Arthur said he was working on it. Cody Mays heard the news and was not seen in the vicinity of the Blackwell homestead after that, which suited everyone concerned. They married in March of 1883, in the church at Caldwell, on a morning when the first true spring weather had arrived, and the sky was that particular shade of blue that the Kansas sky reserves for days that deserve color. Mee wore her good blue dress, the one she had made the year after Thomas died, altered now to fit the way she had changed, and she wore her hair down because Arthur had once said something about her hair that she had not forgotten, something quiet and specific that she did not share with anyone. Clara was, at her own insistence, the official witness and also in charge of the flowers, which she had gathered from the first wildflowers showing in the fields, small and yellow and fierce the way early wildflowers always are, as if they are making a point about survival. The church was full. Caldwell was a town that understood what this day meant, or at least most of it did, and the people in the pews were genuine in their attendance and their goodwill. Mee stood in the doorway of the church looking at Arthur Quinn, who was waiting at the front with Reverend Hollies and looked, in his best coat, and with his dark hair combed and his hands loose at his sides, like a man who was exactly where he had decided to be. She walked up the aisle without anyone to give her away. She was not being given. She was choosing. She reached Arthur and stood beside him, and he looked at her and said very quietly just for her, "Hello, Mee." "Hello, Arthur," she said. Reverend Hollies began the service, and Mee listened to the words of it, the good old words, and she thought about Thomas, because she was a woman who did not pretend things away, and she let herself think about him clearly and without the stone in the river getting larger. She had loved him. She would always have loved him. He had given her Clara and 7 years and a homestead and 1,000 stories, and she carried all of that forward with her into this moment, not as a weight, but as everything that had made her who she was. And she thought about Arthur, who had sat beside her on a boardwalk and listened until she was done, and who had waited, and who had stayed, and who was standing beside her now with the particular stillness of a man who knows what he has and intends to keep it. When Reverend Hollies asked if she would take this man, Mee said yes with a clarity and a volume that made Clara, in the front pew, grin from ear to ear. They had a wedding supper at the homestead, with half of Caldwell seemingly present, and there was music from the 2 fiddle players who played at dances in the church hall, and the evening went on past dark with the warmth of people gathered together, and Clara stayed up 2 hours past her bedtime and fell asleep in Arthur's lap in the kitchen. And Arthur carried her to her bed with the careful ease of someone who has been doing it all her life, and Mee stood in the doorway watching him tuck the blanket around her, and thought that her heart was so full that it was nearly an inconvenience. The spring of 1883 was a good one. The creek ran high from snowmelt and the east acreage was green early, and Arthur took to the homestead with the same methodical, unhurried competence he applied to everything, learning its rhythms and its needs, consulting me on every decision of consequence, because he understood whose farm this was and had never had any intention of claiming it, only of tending it. They worked side by side in the mornings before the day got away from them, me and Arthur and sometimes Clara when school was not in session, and me discovered that working beside someone who worked the way Arthur worked was a particular kind of pleasure she had not anticipated, the steady, unhurried quality of it, the way he could be silent beside her for an hour, and it was not empty silence but full silence. The kind that means two people understand each other well enough that words are one option among several rather than the primary medium. In the evenings they sat on the porch when the weather allowed, and Arthur sometimes read aloud from whatever book me had borrowed from Mrs. Aldrich, and Clara listened and me listened, and the nights settled down around them with the particular peace of a household that is in good order. Me found herself, in those evenings, looking at Arthur and feeling something that she could only describe as gratitude on a scale that was almost vertiginous. Gratitude for the October morning on the boardwalk. Gratitude that she had said what she said. Gratitude that she had been standing in just that place and had been found by just that man who had the patience and the character to sit beside her and listen until she was done. In May, me told Arthur she was with child. She told him on the porch in the evening, matter-of-factly, because she did not know how to be anything other than matter-of-fact, and Arthur was quiet for a long moment that she could not read, and then he turned to look at her, and his expression was the most open she had ever seen it, like a door blown wide. "Me," he said, and that was all, just her name, but the way he said it contained everything. She nodded. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat in the May evening with the smell of new grass and the creek running, and the first fireflies starting to do their small lantern work in the dark, and neither of them needed to say anything else for a very long time. Clara, when she was told, performed a series of calculations about age differences and shared bedrooms and the naming rights she was prepared to assert, and then declared that she would teach the baby everything important, which covered a great deal of ground in Clara's estimation. Me spent the summer of 1883 running the homestead with Arthur beside her and growing larger and more deliberate in her movements, and the pregnancy was not easy in the practical sense because no pregnancy was easy on a working farm, but it was good in every other sense, and me let it be good. She had learned, slowly and imperfectly, to let things be good when they were good. This had been the hardest lesson of the years since Thomas died, harder than the physical labor of the farm, harder than the financial calculations of a woman alone, harder than explaining death to a small child. The hardest thing had been learning that allowing happiness was not a betrayal of grief, that grief and joy could occupy the same body without one canceling the other, that love was not a finite resource that depleted when you used it, but something that grew in the using, the way a path grows clearer with each person who walks it. On a warm September night in 1883, Arthur Quinn sat in the kitchen of the Blackwell homestead, now as much his home as any place he had ever known, and held his son. The boy was born in the early hours of the morning, delivered with the competent assistance of the town's doctor and Hattie Crane, who had appointed herself essential to the process, and was, in fact, essential to the process. He was solid and vigorous, and had Arthur's dark hair and me strong hands, and he arrived in the world with the emphatic announcement of someone who had a great deal to say. Arthur held him and looked at him with an expression that Clara, peering from the doorway, said later looked like how you look when you find something you had stopped expecting to find. Me watched Arthur hold his son and felt something complete, something that was not the absence of anything, not the managed functional feeling she had been calling fine for 6 years, but the real and total and overwhelming thing that she had come back to believing in. They named him James Thomas Quinn. James for Arthur's father and Thomas for the man who had come before, because Mae had never intended to erase Thomas from the story of her life, only to continue the story after him, and Arthur had understood this from the beginning and had never needed to be asked. Clara held her brother with the serious concentration of someone who had waited a long time for this particular responsibility and intended to do it justice, and she said, after a long moment of study, "He looks like Papa." "Your Papa," she said, looking at me, around the eyes. Mae looked at her son's face and thought that Clara might be right, and she did not know whether this was a trick of the heart or the actual arrangement of a small face, but she held it carefully either way. Autumn of 1883 settled over Caldwell with its usual clear-eyed beauty, the sky going vast and blue and the cottonwoods along the creek turning yellow, and the homestead had the particular quality of a place that has found its full population. Arthur had made certain changes to the house in the months since the wedding, not the large overhaul of a man asserting ownership, but the small, careful additions of a man making himself part of a place. A better set of shelves in the kitchen, built to the specific height Mae needed. A covered porch added to the north side of the house for sitting in summer's worst heat. A proper stable for Dallas alongside the existing barn, because Dallas had earned a proper stable. The windmill was maintained with the regularity of a man who had learned from experience what happens when the windmill is not maintained. Mae had put Thomas's rifle up on a higher shelf, not to hide it but because Clara was getting curious about things at table height, and because it was time. She had left it where it was for 6 years, and now it lived a little higher, and she felt, when she moved it, that Thomas would have understood. The tin box under the bed still held his wedding band. She had taken it out once in October to show Arthur, and she had told him the whole story of the ring, the ranch foreman and the intolerable assumption and the removal of the signal, and Arthur had listened in his particular way, and at the end he had said, "That was the right thing to do for yourself." And she had put the ring back in the box and left it there, preserved and honored and no longer a wound. Hattie Crane came to see the baby in October and held him with the practiced ease of a woman who had held many babies and pronounced him exceptional, which Mae considered a reliable opinion. "You look like yourself again," Hattie said to me. "I feel like myself again," Mae said, "for the first time in a very long time." Hattie looked at her with the direct warmth of a woman who has known you through the worst of it. "He is good for you," Hattie said, meaning Arthur. "He is," Mae said. "He is also just good in himself. That is the thing I keep thinking about. He is a good person in himself, and I am glad to know him." Hattie smiled. "That is the right order of it," she said. "That is how it ought to go." There was a town dance in November at the church hall, the annual end-of-season celebration that Caldwell held every year with fiddle music and square dancing and the best potluck supper in the county. Mae and Arthur went, because Mae had always gone, and this year going was different. Going this year was a pleasure rather than a performance of well-being. They danced. Arthur danced with the same competence he applied to most physical things, not showy but capable and entirely present, and Mae danced with him, and felt the warmth of the hall and the music and the bodies of the people she had lived among for years. And she thought about the first time she had come to this dance after Thomas died, the year after, how she had stood against the wall and watched the other couples and felt the absence beside her like a physical shape, like something that took up space. There was no absence beside her now. There was Arthur Quinn, who turned her under his hand and brought her back with a steadiness that she had come to understand was simply who he was, steadiness all the way down, steadiness that was not performance but character. Clara danced with anyone who would dance with her, which was most of the room, and by the end of the evening she was on the shoulders of a 17-year-old boy named Tom Whitfield, who was attempting to demonstrate some form of acrobatic flourish that Mae watched with the resigned equanimity of a mother who knows her daughter is going to be entirely too much for people her whole life, and is proud of this. They drove home under a November sky full of stars, James asleep in Mae's arms and Clara asleep against Arthur's shoulder with her dance shoes still on, and the horses moved easy in the cold air, and the homestead came into view with the windmill standing clear against the stars. Mae looked at the windmill. She had looked at that windmill from this road for 9 years, first as Thomas's wife and then as a widow, and now as Arthur Quinn's wife and the mother of 2 children and the owner of a farm that was thriving. And the windmill was the same as it had always been, patient and functional and turning in the wind, and the farm was the same, and she was the same woman in all the ways that counted, and yet everything was different in the way that matters most. That winter was the kind of Kansas winter that is also a teacher. The cold came in earnest in December and did not break until March, and the homestead pulled together into itself, the way all working farms do in winter, conserving warmth and labor and the particular intimacy of being snowbound together. Arthur and me spent long evenings by the fire with James between them and Clara doing her lessons at the table and the whole structure of it, the warmth and the small sounds of the household, the cat asleep on the hearth and the wind pressing at the windows, and the baby's solid weight and Arthur's shoulder against hers, felt to me like something she wanted to lean into and keep leaning into, not because she was done striving or learning or moving, but because this was a foundation now. This was the ground under her feet. She said this to Arthur one evening imperfectly, trying to find the words for it, and he listened all the way through and then said, "I know. I feel it too." Like the road stopped going and turned into a place. She thought about him saying that, about the road turning into a place, and she thought about what it had meant to him, all those years of roads through other people's lives, all those years of going forward, because stopping had never seemed like something that was available to him. She thought about Rosalie, whose name he said sometimes with a particular gentleness, and she understood that he carried his dead the same way she carried hers, not as a weight that prevented movement, but as everything that had made him who he was, the man who had sat beside her on that boardwalk and listened. They talked about Rosalie on a winter night when the snow was deep, and Clara had gone to bed early, and James was asleep, and the fire was down to coals, and it was the first real conversation they had had about her, not the surface mentions but the interior of it. Arthur told me about Rosalie's laugh and her fear of spiders, and the way she had organized her kitchen with a precision that Arthur had found both impressive and slightly daunting. He told me about the letter, the one he received 3 weeks after the fact, and about the night he had read it in a tent in Tennessee with the sounds of the war still going on outside, and me listened the way he had listened to her all the way through without offering comfort that was not needed because the comfort he needed was simply to be heard. He was quiet for a long time after he finished. The fire made small sounds. "Thank you," he said. "You listened to me," me said. "It has always seemed like the right thing to give back." He looked at her. In the low firelight he looked like something essential, like the particular thing the room was organized around. "Me," he said. "Yes," she said. "I love you," he said. "I do not say it enough. I want to say it now." She felt it all the way to the place where the stone used to be. The stone was not there now, or it was there but smaller, smoothed, the way a stone in a river gets smooth over years of water moving over it, still present but no longer a thing that broke the current. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you since before Christmas, and I have been telling you in every possible way except those exact words. But those exact words are true." He took her hand, the same hand he had held on the boardwalk, the same hand he had held at the altar, and held it with the same precise gentleness, the right amount, the right thing. The winter passed. Spring of 1884 came in stages, each one more generous than the last, and the homestead woke up the way homesteads do, with mud and seed catalogs and the sound of birds re-establishing their territorial claims in the cottonwoods. James was 7 months old and beginning to have opinions about the world that he expressed with great volume, and Clara was 9.5, and had developed a philosophy of education that her teacher Mrs. Aldrich found both impressive and exhausting. Arthur was given a promotion at the stockyard, from drover to assistant foreman, a position that came with a modest increase in wages and a significant increase in the amount of other people's problems Arthur was expected to solve, which he handled with the same methodical patience he brought to everything. Me ran the farm and kept the books and put up preserves in August and baked for the church socials and sang alto in the choir and attended the meetings of the Caldwell Ladies' Aid Society, which she had always attended and which she had always found both useful and occasionally trying. And she lived her days with a fullness that she had not allowed herself to believe was possible on that morning 6 years ago, when she had stood in the middle of Hattie Crane's store, holding a spool of thread she did not need. Shaking from somewhere so deep inside herself that she could not name the place. She had named the place now. She knew what it was. It was the place where you hold the things you cannot say out loud, the grief and the anger and the love and the fear, and the particular loneliness of being known by everyone for what you can do and by no one for what you feel. She had said it out loud. On a boardwalk, to a stranger, with the October sun on both of them, she had said the truest things she knew, and the stranger had become the man she loved, and the man she loved had become the center of her days, and the center of her days had become something she could not have imagined from that boardwalk. It was, she thought on a May evening in 1884, sitting on the porch with Arthur while James explored the boundaries of his blanket with the focused intensity of a scientist, and Clara told Dallas at the hitching post everything that had happened at school that day in considerable detail. It was more than she had expected and exactly what she had needed. Not a replacement, not a revision, not a pretending that things had not happened the way they had happened. Just a continuation. Just the story going forward. She said some of this to Arthur, not all of it, the part she could put into words at that moment, and he listened, and when she was done he said, "I think about that boardwalk sometimes. I think about how I almost did not stop. I was in a hurry to get to the Mercantile for salt and I almost walked right past." Me looked at him. "What made you stop?" she asked. He thought about it. "You had your hands over your eyes," he said. "Like you were trying very hard to hold something in, and I have done that. I have stood like that in front of other people and wished someone would ask, and no one did, and so I asked." Me was quiet for a moment. "I am glad you asked," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every single day." Clara had finished her recitation to Dallas and was now explaining the concept of long division to the horse, who appeared to be following it. James had achieved the edge of his blanket and was looking at the grass beyond it with the expression of someone contemplating a significant decision. The May evening lay over the homestead with its whole gentle weight, the sky going pink and orange over the far flat line of the plains, the cottonwoods catching the last light, the creek making its sound from below the rise. Me leaned her head against Arthur's shoulder. He put his arm around her. They sat like that, the two of them and the children and the horse and the evening, and it was not dramatic and it was not the stuff of dime novels, and it was exactly, precisely, completely everything. Over the next years, the Blackwell homestead, which the town had taken to calling the Quinn place with the particular informal authority of small towns that rename things to match their current understanding of them, grew and changed in the ways that good things grow and change, with intention and patience, and the accumulated effort of people who care about what they are making. Arthur expanded the cattle operation in 1885, purchasing a small herd of his own with savings from the stockyard work, and me managed the books with the precise efficiency she brought to all things numerical, and the two of them made decisions together in the kitchen in the evenings with the ledger between them and their coffee going cold because they kept forgetting it, which was, me had decided, the truest sign that a conversation was worth having. Clara grew. She grew the way children grow when they are given good soil and sufficient water, straight and strong and entirely herself, and she was 12 in 1887, and already showing the particular quality of her mother's directness combined with something of Arthur's patience, a combination that Mrs. Aldrich called an educational challenge, and that Mae privately considered ideal. Clara had begun to talk about Thomas more as she got older, not as a wound but as a story she wanted to understand fully, and Mae told her everything she had been keeping for her, the whole store of it, the plow horse race and the barn cats named after presidents and the sick calf on the boots, and Arthur listened to these stories too, and sometimes added something he had not heard before. An observation about the man Mae described that showed he was listening not just to the anecdotes, but to the portrait of a person, and Mae loved him for this, for treating Thomas's memory with the respect of genuine interest. James was 5 in 1888 and was, as Clara had predicted at his birth, entirely too much for people. He had his father's dark eyes and his mother's iron will, and an energy that the farm absorbed the way the plains absorbed everything, indefinitely and with considerable capacity. He followed Arthur everywhere with the focus of a small foreman conducting an inspection, and Arthur answered his questions with the seriousness they deserved, which was considerable, because James's questions were always considerable. One morning in the spring of 1889, Mae found out she was expecting again. She told Arthur at breakfast in the kitchen, with James eating his porridge and asking whether horses could swim, and Arthur looked at her across the table and smiled, that full-face smile that was still changing his face in a way she still wanted to look at. "Can we name it after a president?" James asked, without looking up from his porridge, apparently having internalized the barn cat story as a family tradition. "We will discuss it," Mae said. They had a daughter in November of 1889, just before the first snow. Mae had been right about the timing, as she generally was about things she predicted with the authority of long experience. They named her Eliza Ruth Quinn. Eliza for no one in particular, except that it was a name that sounded like it expected something of the person who wore it, and Ruth for Mae's mother. Eliza arrived in the world with the quiet focus of someone who has been paying attention to the situation and has decided to manage it herself, and she was dark-haired like her father and green-eyed like Clara, and she fit into the household the way the right tool fits a particular job, so naturally that it was difficult to remember the time before her. Clara was 14 and took her role as elder sister with the gravity of someone who understands that teaching is a calling, not just a task. James was 6 and initially suspicious of the new arrival's claims on everyone's attention, but became, within 3 weeks, her most devoted guardian, a role he performed with the seriousness of a man twice his age. Mae held Eliza in the November afternoon while Arthur sat beside her and James sat on the floor explaining to Dallas, who he had persuaded Arthur to bring to the doorway, that there was now a baby who would also need to be introduced to the horse, and Clara sat with her needlework and hummed something low and pretty, and the house held all of them. Mae looked at Arthur. He was looking at her, and at Eliza both, his expression the same undone open thing it had been when James arrived, and she thought that some people have a capacity for love that is not diminished by use, that gets bigger with each demand made on it, and that Arthur Quinn was one of those people, and she was going to spend the rest of her life grateful for the October morning she had been standing on the boardwalk outside Hattie Crane's dry goods store with her hands over her eyes. The years settled into themselves the way good years do, with the texture of ordinary life that is not ordinary at all when you look at it properly, the texture of shared meals and split firewood, and the sound of children being who they are, and the small daily ceremonies of a household that has learned its own rhythms. Arthur kept the job at the stockyard through 1890, and then left it to manage the cattle operation on the homestead full-time, because the herd had grown to the point where it justified the attention, and because he wanted to be home more, and because he had spent 18 years on roads and he was done with roads in a way that was final and sure. Clara left for normal school in 1891, 18 years old and ready for everything, planning to become a teacher, because she had decided that Mrs. Aldrich was good but that she could be better, and she had a point. She left on a September morning with her bags packed and Arthur standing at the wagon with the expression of a father at a departure, which was what he was, whether or not he had been there at the beginning, and Clara hugged him for a long time and said, "Take care of Mama and the small ones." And Arthur said he intended to, and she hugged me for longer. And me held her daughter and breathed in the smell of her hair, and felt the familiar complicated tangle of pride and grief and joy that is the specific emotional weather of a parent releasing a child into the world. "Thomas would have been very proud of you," me said. Clara pulled back and looked at her mother with those green creekwater eyes. "I know he would," she said, "and so are you, and so is Arthur. That is a lot of proud for one person to carry." "You are strong enough," me said. Clara grinned. "I know I am," she said. "You made sure of it." She climbed into the wagon and drove herself to the stage, because she was Clara and she had decided she would drive herself, and me and Arthur watched her go and stood side by side on the road until the wagon was out of sight. James, who was 8, said, "Can I have her room?" "No," me and Arthur said together, and James looked philosophical about it. The 1890s unfolded with the complexity of that decade. The closing of the open range and the coming of the wire fences and the railroads running everywhere and the cattle business changing in ways that required adaptation and attention. And Arthur adapted and attended with his characteristic patience, and me ran the books and they talked everything through, every decision, every adjustment, because that was how they had always done it, and how they intended to keep doing it. The homestead did well. Not extravagantly well, but soundly well. The kind of well that comes from competent management and hard work and a fundamental willingness to read the landscape and change with it. And by the middle of the decade, the Quinn place was considered one of the solid operations in Caldwell County. Hattie Crane retired from her dry goods store in 1893 and came to supper to celebrate, and told me and Arthur the story of the day they met, from her perspective, which involved considerably more editorial commentary than me recalled, and she made them all laugh, and me thought about the spool of brown thread she had bought that she had never used, which she still had in a tin on the shelf, and thought that some objects earned their place in a household by the history attached to them. James grew into the kind of young man who makes his parents profoundly grateful and occasionally exhausted, which was about right. He was tall like Arthur and direct like me, and he had a gift for horses that was almost supernatural. And by 16, he was the best young horseman in the county and knew it, but was not insufferable about it, which was a minor miracle. Eliza grew quiet and observant and precise, with a gift for numbers that delighted me, and a habit of reading at the table that delighted Arthur, and a way of stating uncomfortable truths with the complete composure of someone who has not yet learned that some truths are supposed to be softened, which she eventually learned but never quite entirely. Clara came home for Christmas every year and wrote letters every month, long letters full of observations about her students and her life in the town where she taught, and the man she was corresponding with, who appeared with increasing frequency in those letters until, in 1894, she came home for Christmas and told them she planned to marry him. His name was Daniel Fry, and he was a schoolteacher too, and he came to meet the family in the spring of 1895 and sat at the kitchen table at the Quinn place and answered Arthur's questions with a straightforward honesty that Arthur approved of, and withstood me's assessment with the dignified composure of a man who understood that he was being evaluated, and accepted this as entirely reasonable. Clara watched her mother assess Daniel Fry and later said to me that she had looked exactly the same assessing Daniel as Arthur had looked assessing her way back at the beginning, steady and direct and entirely serious about it. "That is good," me said. "It means I am paying attention." "You have always paid attention," Clara said. "Both of you have. That is what I want. What you two have, I want that." Mee looked at her daughter and thought about the boardwalk and the spilled grief and the stranger's patient listening, and she thought about how none of this was inevitable, how it had all depended on one October morning and the decision to say out loud the truest thing she knew. "You will have it," Mee said. "You know how to choose well. I have watched you choose all your life." Clara married Daniel Fry in the summer of 1895 in the church at Caldwell, and Mee sat in the front pew with Arthur on one side and James and Eliza on the other, and she watched her daughter marry the man she had chosen, and she felt the fullness of it, the layers of it, the years and the grief and the love and the turning of things, and she did not try to manage what she felt. She just felt it. Arthur found her hand in his in the pew, the same way he always found her hand, with the quiet certainty of someone who knows exactly where the things he loves are. In the years that followed, the Quinn household moved through its seasons with the deep rhythm of a place that has found its particular music. James came into his own as a horseman and cattle manager, and took over more of the day-to-day operation of the herd with the confident efficiency of someone who was born for exactly this work. And Arthur stepped back into a supervisory role that suited both of them perfectly. Eliza grew into her precision and her numbers, and decided in 1896 that she intended to study accounting, which was not a common ambition for a young woman in Caldwell, Kansas in 1896, and Mee said that she should pursue it, and Arthur said he agreed, and between the two of them, they made it clear to Eliza that her intentions were taken seriously, which is all anyone ever needs to make a start. The homestead in 1897 had the particular quality of a place that is old enough to have a history and well-kept enough to have a future. And on an October evening in that year, 15 years after an October morning that had changed everything, Mee and Arthur sat on the porch where they had sat so many times, the porch he had repaired on that cold evening before they were together, the porch that now had a newer railing because the one he fixed had eventually needed replacing. The sky was doing what the Kansas October sky does, going vast and colored and absolute over the plain, and the cottonwoods down by the creek were yellow going gold, and the windmill was turning in the slow wind, and James was in the barn with his horses and Eliza was inside with her books, and the house was full and warm and real. Mee looked at the windmill. "I used to look at that windmill from the road," she said, "when I was driving home. For years I would look at it and it was just a landmark. Just a thing that meant I was almost home, and then I started looking at it differently." "How?" Arthur asked. "Like it meant something else," Mee said. "Like it was proof that things keep turning even when you cannot move them yourself, that some things just go on." Arthur was quiet for a moment, looking at the windmill too. "That October morning," Mee said. "I have thought about it so many times. I have thought about how I walked out of Hattie's store and stood on that boardwalk and I was so tight with everything I had been holding, and I had been holding it for so long, and then you were there, and you asked if I was all right. And I said I was not fine. The most honest thing you had said in years," Arthur said. "Yes," Mee said. "And you sat down, you just sat down beside me. You did not try to fix it. You did not tell me what to feel. You just sat there and you listened. You had things worth listening to," he said. "Arthur," she said. "Me," he said. She looked at him, this man she had loved for 15 years, this man who had the same silver scar above his left eyebrow and the same dark, almost black eyes, and was gray at the temples now, and had more lines at the corners of his eyes now, and was, if anything, more himself than he had been on that boardwalk, more settled, more present, more there. "I have never thanked you properly," she said, "for listening, on that boardwalk. I have thanked you for 1,000 things since then, but I have never said specifically that what you did on that boardwalk changed my life. Sitting there and listening and not going anywhere, that changed everything." He looked at her for a long time. "You changed your own life," he said. "You spoke, you said the true things, I just stayed. Staying is not nothing," she said. "You said that once about capable. That capable leaves a person alone a lot. Staying is the opposite of that. Staying is the most generous thing a person can do." He took her hand, the same precision, the same right amount. "I plan to keep staying," he said. "I know," she said. "I have counted on it for 15 years. The October evening moved around them, slow and gold and absolute. The kind of evening that the plains do when they are feeling generous. The kind of evening that reminds you that beauty is not a metropolitan property, that it lives also in the long flat spaces and the windmills and the yellow cottonwoods and the creek you can hear but not see, that it lives in the ordinary days of an ordinary life that is, when you look at it properly, not ordinary at all. Inside the house, Eliza was bent over her accounting books with the focused precision of someone who sees the world in columns and finds it beautiful. James was in the barn, talking to his horses in the low, unhurried voice of his father, patient and specific, as though the horses understood and deserved the courtesy. Clara was in her own house with her own family, but her letters were on the kitchen table where they always were, long and full and present. Thomas was in the tin box under the bed, in the ring that Mae no longer needed to wear to know that she had loved him, and in the green eyes of her daughter, and in the stories she still told, because stories are the way the dead stay part of the living, not as stones in a river but as the water itself, moving and necessary and everywhere. And Arthur was beside her on the repaired porch of the homestead that was his home and had been for 15 years, holding her hand in the October evening, staying. Mae looked at the windmill turning in the slow wind and thought that she had been granted something extraordinary, not in spite of the grief, but after it and through it and carried on the back of it, and that the extraordinary thing was simply this: the ordinary days of a life that had room in it for everything, for the dead and the living and the grief and the joy and the work and the rest and the speaking of true things and the listening when other people spoke theirs. She had said it out loud on a boardwalk and a stranger had listened until she was done, and then he had stayed, and then he had become the man beside her, and the story had kept going, the way good stories do, with more road ahead than behind even when you thought you had come to the end. The windmill turned. The cottonwoods held their gold. The creek ran below the rise, over its smooth old stones, and the October evening said what October evenings say to people who have learned to hear them, which is simply this, and simply this, and simply this. Mae leaned her head against Arthur's shoulder. He put his arm around her. They sat on the porch and watched the sky go dark together, which was the whole of it.